Deus, o salutaris nostra, Domine ex Deus, Kyrie ex Deus, Deus noster, Domine ex Deus, Angeli, Ave Pateti, Laudem Domino Maestatis,
Hey, how's everybody doing? I've been having a fantastic day. It is Friday, October 3rd, and I have a fantastic show for you tonight. I apologize for being late. My lateness had to do with a house showing. They were supposed to come at 4 o'clock. They decided to show at 4:45 and then stayed like an hour after they were supposed to. So not my fault. It's not my fault that I'm late this time, but I'm glad to be here. I have a very awesome show for you tonight because but I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive. Unfortunately, this will have to be cut a little bit short because I have fishing after this and I cannot be late for fishing. But I wanted to go over the issue of development of doctrine. I'm going to be discussing some of the scholastic disputes about the development of doctrine. I'm going to be discussing the role of St. John Henry Newman when it comes to the development of doctrine, some of the stuff that he got right, some of the stuff that he changed on, et cetera, et cetera. So it should be an awesome show for you tonight. Remember, before we continue, to like, to subscribe, and also if you go into the description of the video, I have two things listed for you. One, I have listed my Substack because on my Substack, I have been writing a bit about things which are related to this. My Substack is mostly about all of my scholastic theology notes and commentary and responses to questions that I give, stuff like that. So if you really want to dive deep into all of these different areas, you want to read all of these cool random disputes throughout the history of scholasticism, I would suggest that you check out the Substack. This morning, I released an absolutely awesome post. I think I didn't write it, obviously. It was a translation. It's a translation of the Salmonticenses. So they are the Discalced Carmelites of Salamanca. They wrote a very extensive treatment of the issue of implicit faith, which obviously relates to the post-conciliar church, Vatican II, possibility of salvation for those who are outside of the external bonds of the church, stuff like that. And it's treated in the 17th century. So this is way before the contemporary debates. So it's a very interesting piece. So I would suggest you check that out. And then also I have a work which will kind of bring me into the essence of what this video is even going to be about. It's a work on St. Thomas's view of the development of doctrine because, well, you guys have probably heard, if you have been on the internet for any longer than 5 minutes and you've been in all of these different Catholic versus Protestant, trad versus not trad, Orthodox versus Catholic debates, you'll get this really weird narrative. And this really weird narrative is that you had this idea from the beginning of Christianity up until the 19th century as basically a pure sort of crystallization or lack of any sort of development when it comes to doctrine, when it comes to teaching. You have everybody before the 19th century, they just think that, the apostles were going around preaching preaching Vatican I, ad literam. So like according to the letter, they were going out and expressly, expositing what was spoken about in the medieval schools. They were expressly expositing what was being spoken about in the Council of Trent. All of these debates, we think that the apostles were just talking about this and the early fathers were just talking about this. But all of a sudden in the 19th century, we had St. John Henry Newman, right? And St. John Henry Newman, for the first time in history, apparently, he spoke about the idea of the development of doctrine. And some will say, well, this was just rejected, and in Vatican II it was accepted. And throughout the entire history of the church, nobody ever spoke about the development of doctrine until St. John Henry Newman. And specifically, the reason why St. John Henry Newman talked about this was because St. John Henry Newman, he just knew that he couldn't, as a good historian, he couldn't square the circle of the teaching of the Council of Trent and eventually papal infallibility. He cannot square that circle unless he made up a new idea of the history of doctrine. That's basically the idea that will be given to you, and it's pure and complete nonsense. As we're going to go over, the explicit debates over development of doctrine happened for centuries and centuries before St. John Henry Newman. And actually, most theologians will argue that this was something which was already quite present in an explicit form in the Church Fathers. Some will argue going as far back as like St. Irenaeus or Origen, or especially St. Vincent of Lérins. They will show that actually this idea of the development of doctrine is something that was well before St. John Henry Newman. And really what we'll see through actually a solid historical analysis of what went on in these debates is that St. John Henry Newman, he actually was explicitly drawing from earlier debates. He was explicitly drawing from, especially when you read, if any of you have ever heard of his letters to Father Patron. Father Patron, he was a Roman theologian. He was basically the teacher of St. John Henry Newman after he converted. You'll see that actually St. John Henry Newman, he got these ideas from Francisco Suarez. Francisco Suarez had his own issues in his particular way in which he formulated it. And Father Patron actually helped St. John Henry Newman move past some of his less mature ideas. And we see by the end of his life, actually, that St. John Henry Newman had a few differences from his essay, because if you remember the sort of chronology of the whole instance, St. John Henry Newman, he wrote and published his essay on the development of Christian doctrine before he even became Catholic. And for decades and decades after he became Catholic, in many different works of apologetic, historical, and doctrinal analysis, he actually built upon what he wrote in the development of Christian essay on the development of Christian doctrine. And he actually changed, or at least modified, some of his expressions on this point. So I would just definitely suggest, if you want just to read, okay, what did St. Thomas say about the development of doctrine, definitely check out that book that I linked below. But to kind of go over and debunk a few myths, I mentioned the first one to begin, is that a lot of people will say that St. John Henry Newman, he was the first one to speak on the issue of development of doctrine. And actually, we'll get into this, there were two distinct moments of very strong debate before St. John Henry Newman on the issue of the development of doctrine. And this wasn't an instance of some people affirming development of doctrine and other people denying development of doctrine. Actually, what this was a debate over the specific nature of development of doctrine. So everybody believed in the development of doctrine. It was a question of how exactly are we going to formulate on these particular questions, which we'll go through a few of those particular questions. And interestingly enough, even after St. John Henry Newman in the 20th century, there was another debate over the development of doctrine between those in the Thomistic school, between, on the one hand, Father Garrigou-Lagrange and Father Reginald Schulte, however you pronounce his French name, and on the other hand, Father Francisco Marin Sola. There was some debate that actually occurred in the 20th century, kind of apart from, and not really even auxiliary to, St. John Henry Newman's essay. Of course, they reference it and say that it was, a work that was very popular. But the idea that this was somehow the be-all, end-all of Catholic teaching on the development of doctrine, the fact that it was perfect, the fact that this was the final word, whether for St. John Henry Newman himself or for Catholic theology, that is completely ridiculous. Actually, funnily enough, Father Francisco Marin Sola, he has this awesome statement. And what he basically says, he says that if you read St. John Henry Newman and you only read his essay, you basically have a partial understanding of St. John Henry Newman. He says that you haven't even begun to be acquainted with St. John Henry Newman's ideas on the development of doctrine if you just read his essay and you don't read his further works, if you don't read those apologetic and historical works that he wrote as a Catholic. And then there's this other idea. So there's this other idea from some figures. So you'll have the figures who basically say this was invented by St. John Henry Newman. He just kind of came up with it, and this was somewhat of a novum. But you have some other individuals, and what these individuals will do is they'll do something which is even worse to the Catholic teaching on this. And what these individuals will do is they'll basically pretend as if St. John Henry Newman and his essay, that is the principal point from which all Catholic reflection on the development of doctrine ought to occur. So what they'll basically do is if they want to load up a stream or a video or an essay or an article on the issue of development of doctrine, what they will do is they will basically crack open the essay on the development of Christian doctrine, and they will summarize what Newman says. They will go in and they'll say, okay, here's what he says for an ideal development. Here's what he says for a doctrinal corruption. Here's what he says for all of the instances. We're good now. This is all that Catholic theology has to say about the development of doctrine. This is the best that we have to say. This is all that we can reference. And actually, we're going to give a full understanding of the development of doctrine from this essay. And that's actually not even true at all from a number of different points of view, including, as I mentioned, the fact that St. John Henry Newman himself actually developed, no pun intended, his own idea of the development of doctrine. Worst among these is actually the fact that when St. John Henry Newman began, I did a whole long Twitter post about this, which if you're part of Substack, you'll get a lot of different posts like this. But I did a whole long Twitter post about this, and I'll reference some of these issues. But the first and foremost issue of the essay on the development of Christian doctrine is the fact that at this point in his life, St. John Henry Newman was basically a Suarezian. And by the time of Vatican I, nobody is a Suarezian on the issue of the development of Christian doctrine. Most of the Jesuits are following Lugo. The Scotists are following the Scotist school. You'll have the Thomists. They're split between those who follow Father Francisco Marin Sola, which obviously happened a little bit later, and those who follow the classical formulation of the Summonticenses. So by this time, a lot of the positions which he happens to take both in the essay and in his treatise, his dogmatic treatise, which was sent to Father Patron, these are basically issues which are, how do I put it? They're out of date. They're outdated. These are a lot of outdated ideas in theology that had basically been abandoned in the early 17th century after Suarez, because Lugo is basically the line that a lot of the Cardinal Juan de Lugo is the line that a lot of the Jesuits will follow on this point. So it's outdated. He's following Suarezian trends, and he clears up a lot. And another point that actually clarifies this a lot is that in his early life, I'll mention this later in more detail, but in his early life, he follows certain formulations that often get accused of being modernistic. So there were a lot of individuals during this time, both of the modernists and unfortunately some of Catholic authors, who accused St. John Henry Newman in his ideas of the development of doctrine as following the modernists. And this was on the basis of two claims. And some of these claims are false. Some of these claims are kind of true, but not exactly fair points to make. One of the claims was that the particular mode in which he imagined the development of doctrine. So the development of doctrine, it's something which happens both in an intellective and in an affective way. The intellective way is, you're deducing conclusions from premises. So like, for example, if we had the premise that Christ is a man, we can draw the conclusion that Christ had human knowledge. Like, that's a valid conclusion that we can make, a conclusion that we can make in theology, and according with some, a conclusion that can be defined by the church dogmatically. And there's a second way, which is the affective way. So this is kind of the way in which you can think about something like the Immaculate Conception coming about. The Immaculate Conception, for the most part, was pushed a lot, although obviously this was also spoken of in an intellective way as well. It was pushed a lot by the piety of the lay faithful. The lay faithful had a certain quasi-experiential knowledge and had a certain sense of the dignity of the Blessed Virgin that caused them to view as repugnant in many areas any sort of inclusion of original or actual sin. So a lot of the origination and push for the dogma of the Immaculate Conception comes from the piety of the lay faithful. So this is the second way, the affective way. And these ways actually in many cases work together. You'll have the affective way pushing, And then the intellective way is going to sharpen and clarify what is going on in the sense of the faithful. This especially occurs in the Immaculate Conception, as many know, between the different debates that happened in the theological schools. Well, the issue is that for St. John Henry Newman, a lot of his formulations seemed like, especially in his letter to Cardinal Perron, Father Perron, it seemed like as if he was saying that this did not happen intellectually and it only happened affectively. And this is something that the modernists say. The modernists, they have this idea of a religious sense, a religious sentiment. And what they would say is through the affective experience of the knowledge of divine revelation, which they completely define differently than the way in which Catholics define it. They would say through this affective sense and the sentiment, that is the way the religious feelings, that's the way in which we come about the truer understanding of Christian dogma over and above the divine revelation that comes through the deposit of revelation by scripture and tradition. So St. John Henry Newman, a lot of his formulations tended towards an overemphasis of the affective part of it. So some claim that he was a modernist, and that's not really fair at all, actually. So in his later formulations, he's very sharp and very clear on emphasizing both the affective and the intellectual aspect. And then the other issue that ends up coming about is his idea of the organ or the mode of assimilation. Because generally speaking, everybody is going to agree, and I'm having a very long introductory section, but I hope that this is helpful for summarizing a few things and for interesting you. But everybody is going to agree that when it comes to the development of doctrine, as it says in Vatican I, quoting St. Vincent of Lorraine, this is going to be an increase in development and explication of the knowledge of the deposit of revelation, but it happens in the same kind, in the same sense, et cetera, et cetera. So what everybody is going to agree is they're going to agree that this is going to be through drawing forth conclusions or clarifying concepts that are already contained in the apostolic deposit. This is going to be already there at the preaching of the apostles. We're just drawing forth conclusions that are already there. So there's not this idea of some sort of continuing revelation, which interestingly enough is an error that Suarez falls into. But there's not going to be this idea of what's called a transformistic evolution, that we're actually taking stuff from outside of the deposit of faith, the deposit of revelation, and we're bringing it in from the outside. So if anybody has read the essay on the development of Christian doctrine and carefully read it, they'll know that St. John Henry Newman often speaks about assimilation. He will say that we have assimilated various different things from outside of the original deposit. So we'll assimilate these things from Greek culture, we'll assimilate these things from Roman culture, we'll assimilate these things from whatever can be found in pagan culture that is still good. I mean, like Northern European paganism. So we'll go and assimilate all of these things from outside the deposit and bring them in. Well, what does that sound like? If you're not careful, and if you don't read very carefully, that sounds like he's saying that actually there is an objective outside of the intellect rather than a subjective, but there's an objective growth that happens to where we now have more, objectively speaking, than the apostles had. It's not merely an increase in understanding in the same sense and genus. This is actually, we're bringing stuff from outside. So this idea of the organ of assimilation was seen as being unfortunate terminology, might be the best way of putting it. But actually, when you go and you read a lot of what St. John Henry Newman writes in later life, he's very clear that assimilation wasn't the best way of putting it. And actually, what he meant by assimilation is these are really giving us the intellectual tools for being able to dive more deeply into divine revelation. So the charge of modernism on the basis of the language of assimilation actually wasn't really the best way of putting it, but he meant it in an orthodox sense. And Father Francisco Marin Sola, he has an awesome treatment of this. And if you want to read about this, you can go to my Twitter and you can read the entire section where I wrote about this in more detail and such. So there's another part of this that I want to treat before I get into these details. And this is the idea that basically the development of doctrine is a theory. So a lot of people, they will put that St. John Henry Newman, he had this theory of doctrinal development. And they'll say this theory of doctrinal development was held by him. But basically, if you're a Catholic in good standing, it's kind of optional. You can hold to the theory of doctrinal development, and some may say, oh, well, this was actually taught by Vatican II, or oh, this was actually, taught by the post-conciliar church. But this is actually not something that is too serious, that people can take it, people can leave it. This is basically a private theological opinion of St. John Henry Newman. A lot of people, this is how they will frame it. But as I mentioned before, this is not true at all. Actually, this is the consensus of theologians for centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries before St. John Henry Newman ever wrote the essay. This is the consensus of theologians, which is established in their words by actual praxis of the church. So it's not something that's actually optional for a theologian. If you are a Catholic, you have to hold to an idea of the development of doctrine. It's not optional. And this is something that was actually dogmatically taught in De Filius by the First Vatican Council. This is what it says in De Filius. Quote, hence too that meaning of the sacred dogmas is ever to be maintained which has been once declared by Holy Mother Church, and there must never be any abandonment of this sense under the pretext or in the name of a more profound understanding. So a lot of people, they will quote this first half of the quote and say, well, this is somehow contrary to the idea of the development of doctrine. This is actually Redeem Zoomer, funnily enough, he brought this up, which was a bit embarrassing since every single theologian at the First Vatican Council held to the development of doctrine. But anyways, they will quote this and they will say, well, this is against the idea of the development of doctrine. But this is the twofold sense, right? So they'll bring forward this, is that actually we have to keep to the one sense in which the Holy Mother Church has always held. But then it says, quote, may understanding, knowledge, and wisdom increase as ages and centuries roll along, and greatly and vigorously flourish, and each and all in the individual and the whole church, but this only in its own proper kind. That is to say, in the same doctrine, the same sense, and the same understanding. So to have this twofold statement, and I'll explain this theologically with all the terms, but basically the two propositions that get held next to each other at Vatican I is, on the one hand, there is an immutability. There's an immutability of the deposit of revelation. You can't stray from, you can't go against, you can't abandon the sense in which Holy Mother Church preaches divine revelation. But on the other hand, what it says is that actually what you need to do is you need to dive into that one deposit and bring forward treasures old and new, as the saying goes. I think it's from, is it from Isaiah? I think. But it says you need to dive deeply into the deposit of revelation, and there will be an increasing of knowledge and of understanding as time goes on, because there's a certain inexhaustibility to the deposit of revelation. And this comes from the fact, and this is actually the what the theologians will call the formal reason or the formal ratio of why we have the development of doctrine. And basically the formal reason or the formal ratio of why we have the development of doctrine is because we as human beings, we are not like the angels and we're not like God. When it comes to the angels and when it comes to God, they actually have a simple intuition of the object which is presented. Obviously, God knows through himself all things. The angels know through what we call connatural infused species. I know that sounds very complicated, but basically the idea is that when it comes to the angels receive the object and they understand everything about the object. They understand its properties. They understand what can be deduced from it. They understand its cause and its end. They understand everything that's presented before them. Whereas we humans, we go through a process of discursus. What's discursus? Basically, what discursus means is that when we see a certain principle, a certain object, like, for example, Christ is a man. Like we think of this proposition in our intellects, Christ is a man. We don't immediately perceive in this that Christ, somebody may not know about the fact that the intellect and the will and the sensible appetites are a part of human nature. They may not know that these distinct type of knowledge or these distinct passions are a part of human nature. They may not know these things. So whereas an angel, in the very fact of knowing that Christ is a man, sees all of those things, for us, we need to use the process of reasoning to come and to understand all of those things about that distinct object. So when it comes to divine revelation, because we are not angels and because we are men, there's actually a slow and gradual process whereby we come to fully understand something. And that's the reason why, no matter who you are, if you are reasonable in this conversation about the development of doctrine, if you are not ideologically driven to somehow accuse this of modernism or somehow give all of those various different slanders that the enemies within and outside of the church give to the development of doctrine, if you are a reasonable person and you think about what theology is and what understanding is in a reasonable way, well, you will come to necessarily conclude, if you are a reasonable person, not darkened by bias and ignorance and all of these false attachments. If you're a reasonable person, when you think about this idea, the development of doctrine, if you think about the idea that we actually slowly and over time come to understand distinct bodies of knowledge handed on to us, the consequences of this, the causes of this, the properties of this, if you are an intelligent person who is open-minded, what you will actually see is that anybody who spends a few minutes thinking about this problem and thinking about the nature of human knowledge is going to come to this conclusion. It's a necessary conclusion that everybody will perceive if they just kind of think through the problem without bias. This is the way in which we come to understand things. And what I want to do first, kind of getting into this, is I also want to clarify a few points of what development of doctrine is not. Because we can talk about all the time what development of doctrine is, but a lot of people, including people like, I don't know, Gavin Ortland, or maybe you can think about some trads, or maybe you can think about some other Protestant apologists or Orthodox apologists. When they come to understand and think about the development of doctrine, what they're usually thinking about, and this unfortunately, very unfortunately, is one of the objects in which St. John Henry Newman spent a lot of time in his essay on the development of doctrine. Although, precisely speaking, as Sola says, this is actually not really the department of the development of doctrine. It's the department of maybe ecclesiastical history, maybe canon law, maybe a liturgical history or something like that. Is that actually the development of doctrine is not at all about liturgical practices. It's not at all about the change of outward rule or expression or anything about like that. That's not actually what development of doctrine is. So something like communion in one kind, that's not development of doctrine. Something like the abandonment of paedo communion in the West, that is not a development of doctrine. Something like certain rites surrounding baptism, or something like the ways in which the popes may express their rule or practically rule. We can compare, the way in which Pius IX and the way in which Pius XI ruled, or the way in which Innocent III and Pope Francis ruled. These things are not development of doctrine. Those are the development maybe of the ways in which liturgical laws function. Those are maybe the ways in which canon law functions. But none of those things are actually per se, when we talk about the development of doctrine, none of those things are actually about the development of doctrine. So when it actually comes down to it, what we are talking about is we are simply talking about the increase in the understanding of revelation. The increase in the understanding of revelation. We have that deposit, and actually I want to clarify this point as well, because a lot of people may misunderstand this. We're not talking about the increase of understanding over and above the apostles. The apostles, in their charism as the first teachers of the church, they were given a certain extraordinary gift where they understood, kind of like the angels, they understood all of the different virtualities of their teaching. They understood all of the different aspects to it because they had to be these first teachers. So we're not talking about an understanding greater than the apostles or anything like that. Rather, when we're talking about the increase in understanding that Vatican I mentions, and quoting St. Vincent of Lorraine, what we're talking about an increase over the original recipients of divine revelation. So we have the people in the first century. These people, they have the apostles, they have our Lord, they preach to them divine revelation, they receive divine revelation, they hear something like, let's say they hear the word was made flesh, right? The word was made flesh. They hear that, they think about it, they meditate on it. Obviously, it's going to be different. The way in which every single person in the early church the degree in which they understand it for certain people who are more educated, for certain people who may have stronger powers of discursus, people who are more holy. This is actually this affective way in which we talk about as well. People are more holy and more devout. They're going to understand this in a stronger degree. They're going to understand, okay, what exactly is the content of it? What are all those conclusions that we could draw from it? They're going to understand more and more and more about this fact which is presented to them. But then we have other people. These other people, maybe they're less pious, they're less learned, they're more simple. They may understand less about this, okay? And this more or less understanding, this can mean one of two different things. And this is going to take generally the two forms of the development of doctrine. There's going to be a certain conservation, there's going to be a certain increase, okay? Those are the terms that are usually used by the theologians, but they're actually very easy to understand. Because when we're looking at a certain proposition, we can do two things with this proposition. On the one hand, we can actually take the content of the subject and the predicate, the word was made flesh, and we can come to a greater degree of understanding about the subject and the predicate. So let's take the word flesh right there. So somebody may go and have a more distinct understanding of what the term the flesh means. Some people, they may have like a very vague notion of what it means, but other people, they may understand, well, when it comes to the way in which, the authors of the contemporary world speak, actually the flesh is talking about human nature. So when we say the word was made flesh, we're not merely talking about, a body. That's not what we're talking about. Actually, we're talking about the assumption of humanity, human nature, an individual human nature, right? So they may come to that understanding, but that's not really drawing forth a conclusion. The word was made flesh and the word assumed humanity. These two things, they are the same exact judgment. They only are nominally distinct. It's like if I said Socrates is a man versus Socrates is a rational animal. To say Socrates is a man and to say Socrates is a rational animal, these are only nominally distinct only as to name. This is maybe more or less clear, but it's rather the change between a confused knowledge and a distinct knowledge. The analogy that Shaban uses, which I posted some of what he says about this on my Substack recently. The language that Shaban uses, he says it's kind of like if you were 500 feet away from a tree and you were looking at it, you can kind of get the main outlines versus you're right up next to a tree. You can see all the branches and the leaves and the bark and the roots, and you can see everything around it. That is the difference between a confused knowledge of the tree and a distinct knowledge of the tree. And that's the first way in which development is going to happen. But then you could have a second way as well. So let's say you take that the word was made flesh, and clearly you understand that this proposition means that the word assumed humanity. And you actually think, okay, well, what are the conclusions that can be drawn from this? When you're drawing forth a conclusion, the conclusion is contained in the premises. So you're actually not drawing forth a really and objectively distinct conclusion. You're rather just drawing forth what is already said to be virtually contained. Virtus means power. It has the power to give this sort of conclusion. So what you can do here is you can say, well, okay, the word assumed humanity. The will is a faculty of humanity. Therefore, the word assumed a will, a human will. Or you could say the word assumed humanity. The intellect is a power of human nature. Therefore, the word has an intellect. Or you could do the same with the affections or human knowledge. There's a bunch of different things you could do with this, but this is different than the first thing that I mentioned. Like, you're not merely clarifying terms. You're actually drawing forth a conclusion. And this conclusion is a conclusion by the process of reasoning. And this is kind of how all of the different sciences work. Like metaphysics, for example. Metaphysics, we start with different axioms, we start with different first principles, and we use the process of reasoning to draw forth conclusions that are necessary from that premise. So these are the two ways in which theology, or we can talk about the development of doctrine. On the one hand, we could simply talk about the clarification of terms. The clarification of terms happens a lot, and that's very helpful. And that's actually what the magisterium does best. The magisterium takes what is already formally and perhaps in some cases confusedly present divine revelation. Somebody comes around and misunderstands it, like let's say Apollinaris. He misunderstands the word was made flesh. He's like, oh, well, flesh, that must mean merely a body. That's what Arius and Apollinaris thought about the word was made flesh. The magisterium comes along, they're like, no, 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 you misunderstood the term right there. The term flesh is not merely in reference to a body. It's actually in reference to a complete human nature. So the magisterium could do that. But on the other hand, the magisterium could also have a different war, with people. You can have the war of certain people who may draw a false conclusion, or they may not be in that process of reasoning. They may actually have that incorrect second premise. That premise, the word assumes humanity. Humanity includes human operation, let's say. Therefore, the word has human operation, right? This is something which is defined in the Sixth Ecumenical Council. There are some people who may reason improperly and draw forth the wrong conclusion. The magisterium could also, and has also, in dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of different cases, the magisterium has also dogmatically spoke on those matters of conclusion, right, as well. So they can do both things, and these are distinct things, and you're going to have actually some sort of debate between theological schools when it comes to the extension of the magisterium's authority when it comes to that second form of dogmatic development. And then you could have the third form of dogmatic development. The third form is really the form in which the modernists took. And the modernists, they completely screwed this up. They completely messed this up. The modernists, what they said is they said that there's actually what's they called a transformistic evolution. A transformistic evolution. This is denied and dogmatically condemned in Pascendi, among other texts from the magisterium. But basically what the modernists said is well, it's not simply a clarification of terms like the first way. It's not simply a drawing forth of a conclusion in the second way that is really and objectively identical with the premises at hand. Actually, what they're doing is they're actually adding something from outside. So there's like a new revealed object which is present, and over time, the religious sense, those interior virtualities within us by nature, they were weird in a number of different ways. Modernism is a whole can of worms that we could explain. This immanence within us actually leads us to basically continuing revelation. We all get, as long as the religious sense is developing, we're all getting all of these new different objects of divine revelation. And that is the condemned form of the evolution of dogma, is to say that there is some transformistic evolution. It would kind of be like the meme version of like Darwinistic evolution, that you have a monkey evolving into a man. So that second form, actually, I never gave the analogy that Shaven gives for the second form. The first one would be like you go from seeing the tree at 500 yards, and then you see the tree up close, and you see from a confused way and a distinct way. The second form would be, the seed of the tree, and then the actual tree itself. Like the seed and the tree itself, they're of the same species, but they're in a different mode of development. One virtually contains the other. You can go that form of development. That's like the second way. And the third way is kind of like the meme form of Darwinism. So you have like a monkey, and the monkey gets developed into a man. So the monkey to man, these are two distinct species. So therefore, they are distinct objects of knowledge. That's like the modernist form right there. So what I want to get into to kind of explain a little bit of how this is traditional, I want to get into a little bit of the debates that happened in the medieval world and the Baroque world. Unfortunately, my fishing trip might cut short the after show. I will see whether I can do the after show or not. If not, maybe I'll do it after my Monday stream, because I want to get into a few concrete cases of the development of doctrine. So you have ultimately within Catholic teaching, to understand what this dispute was about, you have 4 grades of teaching. And I talk about this, the way in which the magisterium works, something like that. It's a stream that I did. But these 4 degrees are, 1, the revealed data. So what is presented to us from the apostles in sacred scripture, in tradition, public revelation. That is the revealed data. The second degree is you have dogma. So this is divine revelation proposed for our belief by the magisterium of the church, whether the ordinary magisterium, which obviously has chugged back all the way back to the apostles and their preaching, or the extraordinary magisterium, which has taken a number of different forms throughout the history of the church. So that second degree is dogma. It's binding on faith. The third degree is you have those truths which are infallibly taught. So there can be truths which are not taught as dogma, but they are infallibly taught. So this would be, for example, that Vatican II is an ecumenical council, that Pope Leo is the Pope. These are truths which are not binding on divine and Catholic faith. Some will label this as ecclesiastical faith, but these are different truths which are infallibly taught, but they're not infallibly taught as divinely revealed. But these are simply truths which are taught because it is necessary to keep the integrity of revelation. Like, in order to have the dogma of the papacy, it's kind of necessary for us to be able to identify who the Pope is. If you have the dogma about the ecumenical councils, you got to know what the ecumenical councils are. Like, this is pretty obvious. You need to teach these things, but these are not necessarily things which are included in public revelation. And then in the fourth degree, we can call this doctrine. We can call these theological conclusions. These are basically things which do not have faith as their motivating cause. So let's say, for example, that you have drawn forward the conclusion. It's like the 3rd century, so it's before a lot of the dogmas have been explicitly formulated in ecumenical councils or by the popes. But you have a certain dogma like the Immaculate Conception. Like, somebody in the 3rd century is holding to the Immaculate Conception. There's some debate about this, but I'll assume for the sake of argument that this had not at this point been dogmatized in any mode or form. So you have the Immaculate Conception, and the way or the manner in which you perceive the Immaculate Conception is as a theological conclusion that you have drawn forth as a conclusion from Revelation. Now, included in this is obviously you have the divine revelation of the dignity of the Mother of God, let's say. That's usually where they'll go from. And then you have this minor premise of reason, which is that having original sin is contrary to the dignity of being the Mother of God. Therefore, the Mother of God did not contract original sin. So you have this like syllogism that you're drawing, but this is a syllogism. So it's just as strong as the argument is. And when it comes to theological arguments, when it comes to those arguments which come through the reasoning of the theologian or of the individual involved, there's a possibility of mistake. So there's a certain fallibility to it. So it's not something that one could hold by divine faith. Rather, they are holding it by the habit of theology. They're holding it according to the strength of theological reasoning, right? So that would be that fourth grade of teaching. So there is the revealed data itself, dogmas, what's infallibly taught, and then theological inclusion, or we include in there dogmas as well. But there's a certain debate that happens, and this debate is basically on how things go and enter into being a dogma. So in the medieval church, there is a debate between, on the one hand, the Thomists, and on the other hand, you will have the Scotists and the Nominalists. So the Thomists and the Scotists and the Nominalists, they disagreed on the question of, well, before something is defined by the church, is it something which is held by faith? So the way that I explained it, it's kind of a bit cheeky, but the way in which I explained in accordance with the Thomistic opinion, because it's the right position, obviously. But the Thomistic opinion, what it says is, well, before the definition of the church, actually, you can't hold to these things on faith. It could be something which is defined by an ecumenical council or the Pope. It could be by the ordinary and universal magisterium, which obviously goes all the way back to the apostles. But it could be defined in these various different ways. But if it is not defined and you are merely perceiving it by theological reason, it may be a theologically certain argument, but by a theological reason, this isn't something that yet has arisen to the level of faith. That's the Thomistic point of view on this problem. But what the Scotists and the Nominalists will say is the Scotists and Nominalists will say that basically this may be true for people who are not learned in theology. So your average guy in the pews, he may have this version because he does not have certainty by the scientific processes of reasoning. But when it comes to the theologian, they will say that the church is to the simple person what reason is to the theologian. That's what they will say. And they will basically say that even before the definition of the church, if you have a theologian who is so smart that he is able to perceive this with certainty by theological science, that actually this individual, they are bound to assent to this with the assent of faith. And they are able to assent to this with the assent of faith. So that is something that goes all the way back to the medieval period. The medievals, they are going to debate until their faces are blue over this dispute about the development of doctrine. Like a lot of people, they have this idea that the medievals never spoke about the development of doctrine. Well, as we see, the medievals actually had a very distinct understanding of the development of doctrine and debated the finer points of the development of doctrine within the schools. Then you get to the Baroque period, and the Baroque period is very interesting. So the Baroque period, you have these two views, the Scotist view and the Thomist view, and a few other views branch off from this. And this comes in with a weird thing that Molina does, a weird thing that Suarez does. But basically what happens is you have the Scotists, the Nominalists, and Gabriel Vasquez, Gabriel Vasquez, the Jesuit theologian. They hold to that classic Scotist position from the medieval era. And then you have some of the early Thomists. You can think about Capriolus, although he's kind of late medieval. You can think about Cajetan. You can think about, according to at least Father Sola, Melchor Cano. You think about John of St. Thomas. You can think about Domingo Banez. All of these different Dominican Thomists, they are holding to the same position that the medievals held to, right? But then you have something weird, something really, really strange that happens with Molina. Because up to this point, you probably recognize that, yes, there's that question before the development. You have the question before the definition of the church that comes in with all of these different theologians. But how about after the definition of the church? So when it comes to a theological conclusion after the definition of the church, is this something which is binding on faith? Like that's kind of a weird question, because most people intuitively, and up to that point, everybody said, well, yeah, I mean, if they define something as revealed, even if it is only implicitly or virtually contained in the revealed deposit, like, yeah, if they define it as faith, it's of faith. But Molina, he does something like really strange. What Molina says is, actually, when it comes to even after the definition of the church, it's still going to be only held as a theological conclusion. He says, well, you infallibly know that it's a theological conclusion, but it's still a theological conclusion. So when all these councils say, oh, we anathematize those who hold the opposite, or, oh, you have to hold this is all of the Catholic faith, when they make all these statements, according to Molina, they didn't actually mean it. So Molina has this weird view. And then there's a pushback that happens. Everybody kind of freaks out about this. So there's a pushback where people want to destroy, eliminate, knock out of existence Molina. Suarez, who was very fond of Molina in many ways, Suarez actually says it is amazing. Like, it is completely inconceivable that anybody would hold to this position. Like, he's just distraught that his fellow Jesuit has held on to this really weird position that after the definition of the church, theological conclusions are still theological conclusions. We just kind of know them infallibly. Like, he's completely derailed by this. So Suarez, he comes to a different position, and it's a really weird position, because Suarez, what he will do is he's trying to tie in how exactly you could have something go from a theological conclusion and turn it into something of a dogma of faith. Because he's going to say, well, when it comes to these theological conclusions, aren't they kind of not formally revealed? And therefore, how are we even holding this as being of faith? Like, he has this weird moment where he's wondering how this occurs. And the answer that he gives, the Thomists give a different answer, which I'll get into. But the answer that Suarez gives is, he says, well, actually, there's like new divine revelations that occur. Like, it gets revealed through the church, new public revelation. It gets revealed through the church that this is actually contained in divine revelation. Like, that's what Suarez says. And this makes everybody freak out. They're like, what the heck are you doing? One of the most solid principles in Catholic theology is that when it comes to public revelation ceased with the death of the last apostle. So you can imagine, tying this back in with the comments on St. John Henry Newman, you can imagine how weird this would be when you had St. John Henry Newman reading Suarez, which was very common at Oxford during his day. He's reading Suarez and he's drinking in a lot of these ideas, and then he's creating this personal interpretation of the idea of development of doctrine influenced by Suarez. Obviously, he would need to get these a little bit, you need to get these straight, okay? So Suarez says, oh, there's just new divine revelation. That's how it happens. And somebody named Cardinal Juan de Lugo, Lugo is a very prominent, very famous scholastic during the time. He says, he kind of takes the bait. So he takes the bait of Suarez, and Suarez, he defines the theological conclusion in a weird way to where the theological conclusion is actually not contained in the premises. Like that's just what Suarez says in a really weird way. So what Lugo will say is oh, okay, I guess, yeah, you're right about that. But we obviously can't say there are new divine revelations. Like that would just be silly. So what Lugo says is he has something called transformistic or transforming assistance. And this is actually a view that is currently held by theologians, a view that's been held by theologians for a very long time. A lot of people accept the solution of Lugo. But his idea of transforming assistance is basically, well, we're not directly assenting to the fact that these theological conclusions are of divine faith. Rather, what we're doing is we are assenting to the fact that the church is indefectible. So therefore, the church, when they preach these things, we are assenting to the dogma of the church's infallibility, and it just happens to be connected with all of these other things that they say. And this solution is almost as bad as Suarez. It's not quite as bad because, saying that there is continuing public revelation is kind of bad. But Lugo, the issue with that is, like, if the Pope came out tomorrow and said an ex cathedra statement that Scholastic Answers is the best Catholic YouTube channel that has ever been created, like, you wouldn't give the assent of divine faith just because the Pope said something infallibly. Like, the Pope says a lot of things infallibly, or councils or whatever. They say a lot of things infallibly that are not necessarily of divine faith, because there's that third category of those truths which are historically or logically connected with the deposit of faith. There are a lot of things which are infallibly taught, like the fact that Pope Leo is the Pope. Like, that is infallibly taught by the church, but you don't give the assent of divine faith as if that was divinely revealed. So Lugo's solution, it doesn't really work, and it kind of confuses that second category of dogmatic teachings with the third category of those things which are infallibly taught. So then you have the most unfortunate error. So then you get to the Summa Thecenses. So up to this point, the Thomists, they kept the Thomist position that I explained before, which was basically, the fact that after the definition of the church, these theological conclusions, if they are infallibly defined by the church, they are given the assent of divine faith. But the Summa Thecenses, they found the problem in the wrong area. Basically, rather than saying that the Lugo or Suarez, that they were wrong when it comes to the way in which they were defining a theological conclusion, because they were defining the theological conclusion as somehow objectively distinct from the revealed deposit. So rather than holding to the traditional Thomist position of, oh no, these are not purely objectively distinct, but they're actually virtually contained within the deposit, rather than holding to this, they denied a different premise. And it's similar to Molina, but it's slightly different. So they denied the premise. They just said, well, we just don't think the church has ever dogmatically defined anything that's a theological conclusion. We think that any time the church has defined something, that it actually has been something which was formally revealed in the revealed datum. So they find the solution in the wrong area, and they just say, well, the church has never defined a theological conclusion before. So this just sets things into a firestorm. A lot of the theologians following the Summa Thecenses, rather than following the traditional Thomist position, they take a lot of the Thomists afterwards, they take the position of the Somontacenses. So basically, on the one hand, you had the Scotists over there. On the other hand, you had the people following Suarez or Lugo. And on the third hand, now you had the people following the Somontacenses and saying that the church had never defined a theological conclusion. So at this point, the traditional Thomist position kind of faded from the public perception within the schools. But you get something interesting that happens between this point in the 17th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So you had a theologian named Gardale, or Gardale, I think is how you pronounce. I'm not French, okay? I don't pronounce these names properly. But Gardale, he makes some interesting points when he is writing about the issue of divine revelation and the development of doctrine. And he makes these points that, while the Somontacenses said that nothing of a theological conclusion has ever been defined, that is just kind of historically untenable. So while maybe they had a very solid and very well put together scholastic system, a very solid and very well put together theoretical system, practically speaking, this is just not the case. Okay. And you had a theologian by the name of Father Francisco Marin Sola. And Father Francisco Marin Sola, he wrote a series of 28 articles. Eventually, it got taken together and put into a book. This was translated into English. It's called "On the Homogeneous Evolution of Catholic Dogma." I think that's the title of it. But he put out all these articles, and basically what he said is, he said, well, okay, the reason why this doesn't make any sense is because after the Somontacenses, a lot of the Thomists, they just kind of went off in this weird direction. They went off in this wrong direction. They did not hold to the traditional principles of St. Thomas and of Capriolus and Cajetan and Banez and Cano and all of these other theologians before the Somontacenses. They just took off into this weird direction. So he goes back to the older Thomistic position. And basically what he says is, he says, okay, we have the revealed deposit. We have these two forms of evolution, whether of a mere explaining of terms or drawing forth a conclusion. But as we know from solid Thomistic principles, the conclusions, they are not merely nominally distinct, but they're only conceptually distinct from the premises. So this is not something which is distinct purely on the matter of the object, to where it would require some sort of new divine revelation, but actually it's something which is distinct on the matter of the subject. If we were angels, as I said, we could perceive all of these things, but we're men. So we have to go through this process of discursus when we're looking through what is revealed to us. So he says, well, all of these conclusions, they are objectively identical to the revealed deposit. So therefore, if they are divinely revealed and they are infallibly proposed by the church, if you are holding something as infallibly taught by the church to be divinely revealed, then that warrants the assent of faith, whether it's a theological conclusion or it's a mere clarification of what is in the revealed deposit. And the church, in the gift of infallibility, basically presents this to us. So he says, whereas before the definition of the church, you knew this in a fallible mode through theological reason. After the definition of the church, while it is maybe only virtually contained in the revealed deposit, it is still something which is revealed that you know in an infallible way. So therefore, this has to be given the assent of divine faith. So this is what Marin Sola says. This is the classical position of the Thomistic school. But then you had two theologians in particular, although there were more. You have Father Schulte, or Schultz, I had, again, not French. And then you have Father Garrigou-Lagrange. And these two individuals, they held on very strictly and very strongly to the position of the Somontacenses. And what they said is, they kind of just shrugged their shoulders and they said, well, we just think you're wrong. We don't think that there's ever been anything which is a theological conclusion ever defined in the history of the church. And something that is said by a lot of these theologians is, well, go and prove from the entirety of the revealed deposit that this is not contained formally in the revealed deposit. Go and prove that, and then we will hold to your view, but you've never proved that, therefore you cannot. So that's a lot of the history behind it. I had more notes. I had a lot about the affective versus the intellective. I had a lot about the different possible, the 10 different examples of this that frequently get brought forward and get preached by the Thomists. But it's already been an hour. Unfortunately, I've been yapping a lot. I will not have the time to do the after show. I guess I will schedule that for Monday. So become a member, become a patron, patreon.com/Milton Thomas, become a patron or a member, and you'll get access to that when I do the stream on Monday. I'll take a few of the super chats and maybe a few questions if there's any good ones, and then I will go on my merry way. You side with Lagrange? Okay. Yeah, you're not right about this. Was St. Newman ever 18 minutes late for a stream? No, that's because he never did live streams. Wagner, I'm going to be real with you. The Democrat stream was uber gay. If you actually do a part 2, I think we'll all die of cringe. I think it was fun. I think it was cool. You didn't think it was epic that I defended slavery to a Democrat? You didn't think that was funny? I thought that was defending the morality of slavery. Scholastic Answers Part 7 3-hour stream. You didn't think that was awesome? But anyway, I have a lot of commentary on the issue of slavery. I could explain it in a lot more detail, but obviously we were on a time crunch, so I couldn't really go in and give a 20-minute explanation of actually this is how there's forms of slavery that weren't sinful for the saints to engage in and stuff like that. So I thought it was a fun stream. A lot of people thought it was a really cool stream, but if you didn't like it, then just don't watch it. Okay, just don't watch a part 2. Just go and watch something. Become a member and watch all the member streams. You could do that you already are a member. Just watch all the member streams again, if you haven't watched them before. Are you saying RZ does not understand Newman, but he studied Catholicism from Protestants for a month? Dude, this is what triggered me the most, because I became known a while ago because I did a series on the development of doctrine. I went into a lot of this. I never completed it, but I went into a lot of this around 2 years ago. And I kind of made it my thing to just incessantly dunk on all the Protestants who have this really weird narrative about the development of doctrine and St. John Henry Newman. I just went through and would dunk on them all the time. And that was kind of my thing. And I would always get in the comments and, get in the replies and quote tweet people and just be you actually have no idea what you're talking about. Actually, we've talked about the development doctrine long before Newman. You're stupid. You don't know what you're talking about. I would do that. I would do that a lot. And there's no way Redeemed Zoomer has never heard me say that before, that this is a meme. But then he goes and he makes the video and he makes it sound like the development of doctrine is a novelty of St. John Henry Newman. So I don't know if that is deliberately ignoring the evidence, or if that's just the fact that maybe he wasn't paying attention, maybe he forgot. I don't know. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt that he isn't just super dishonest and trying to say not true things. So yeah. Thank you. Become the Knight. This guy's awesome, by the way. W slavery. Okay, let me see. Blessed Pius IX supported the South. Yeah, everybody knows in this. So is there anything which is which isn't contained formula? Oh my goodness. Could you get all the spelling proper? I just can't. I don't mean to belittle or anything. I just can't understand what you're saying. Finishing up Duranzo's Science of Sacred Theology. What's next on the reading plan? That's a good question. I would say after reading Duranzo, everyone should read Duranzo's Science of Sacred Theology. It's a freaking awesome book. You should read the Apologetics and Fundamental Theology manual from Monsignor Joseph Clifford Fenton. It's a good book. You still owe us the Crux interview. Yeah, I know. Dude ignored our super chat. No, I didn't. I'm not shekel there either, so shut up. Yeah, so you mentioned the STS. Yeah, the STS, it takes Garrigou-Lagrange's and Chaltier's view on this, and its reasoning is just not good. It's actually, Father Marine Sola, he made up all this terminology, and he has an interesting way of speaking, and it's kind of cool. And they pretend this is just not a very natural way of speaking, which, if you read the homogeneous evolution of Catholic dogma, which I have twice now. If you read it, the terminology, it makes perfect sense. It's completely sensible from a perspective of looking at the sciences and the way in which sciences develop and the type of conclusions that we can draw from different sciences. Like, it makes a lot of sense. Like, it makes sense that you have three different types of reasoning. Either reasoning, which is an explanation of terms, reasoning, which is a conclusion from a virtually contained premise, and therefore is it's certain, and then you have reasoning, which is only probable because there's not this necessary virtual connection. Like, this makes a lot of sense. Or reasoning, which is done in the physical or moral sciences, also are contained under the third. So they say this is like a novel form of explaining things, and then they go and they're like, well, you can't prove that anything which is a theological conclusion has ever been defined because you can't prove that it was not in divine revelation. So therefore we win. And I think that kind of ignores also the way in which the council fathers at a lot of these councils explain their dogmas. Like, if you go and look at Trent or even earlier councils like Lateran IV, or even, the Sixth Ecumenical Council, Third Constantinople, when you look through a lot of these different formulations, what you actually see is it's pretty clear that they're viewing this as a theological conclusion. So that's some of the problem that I have with the way in which the STS treats things, which is kind of a reminder. There's a lot of diversity between the scholastic schools, and there's in a lot of areas, there's a lot of leeway in which one could have in holding to different positions and different interpretations. And that's not necessarily a reason for taking one person's opinion on everything. Like, I'm not right about everything. Only St. Thomas was right about everything. That's a joke, by the way, kind of. But it's a reason to understand that even Homer nods, even great theologians like the authors of the STS, even they often will say things which are wrong. If the fecundity affiliation is exhausted and begetting is identical to the essence, wouldn't that mean the essence was somehow exhausted, which would be absurd and logically impede the spiration? No, this is not the case, because we have to remember is that when it comes to those terms which are nominal, so like the begetting, the power of begetting and the power of spiration, these are nominal terms. When you read De Potentia, so I would suggest that you read the questions on begetting in De Potentia. St. Thomas, he distinguishes clearly. There is both a relative and an absolute aspect to it. So when it comes to the power of spiration, the power of begetting, it would be wrong to say that this is purely something which is essential. But there's actually an aspect which is essential. And there's an aspect which is notional as well. I don't think RZ is dishonest, but if he had multiple errors in his video that I could identify without research, I'd say his negligence is bad faith. I don't know. He's my friend. I would say that RZ, he's I don't know if like we're not like besties or anything, but it's somebody who I have had a cordial relationship with. So as much as I do crash out on him, and I think a lot of the crash out is justified, I'd still on a personal level, I like the guy, even if like as a content creator, like there's things in which I would find distasteful, wrong, irresponsible, and many other. I would say definitely negligent and irresponsible would be apt for some of what he does, which is even something that is not like merely like, oh, this is papist cope. Oh, this is like a Catholic cope that we say these things. We say these things towards Protestants. It's not only Catholic, but I've seen this from Protestants as well when they comment on some of the things which RZ says about their respective denominations. Pinesap talks about RZ the way you should. I will have Pinesap on next Wednesday, so we shall see. Address Leo's comments on immigration. How about you address the topic of which the stream was about? This is why I need to bring back the Q&A sessions, because we got to keep locked in on the topic of the stream, being asking questions about the topic of the stream. Did you read Blessed Raymond Lowell? I don't know how to pronounce the last name. No. Okay. Anyways, I got to get going. I hope that you guys appreciated this. Remember to like, subscribe, check out the book on St. Thomas and the Development of Doctrine, link below. Check out my Substack if you want to read more, and check out that long post that I did on Twitter from earlier. So I hope that you all have a fantastic rest of your day. And as always, God bless.